There's a building in Rome that doesn't appear on most maps. No tourists take pictures of it. No guidebooks mention its halls. But inside those walls, inside those locked vaults, lies more financial power than most nations will ever possess. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. This is the Vatican Bank. And what it became, what it was allowed to become, should terrify anyone who believes in accountability, because when you mix faith with money, when you blend divine authority with earthly greed, you don't get salvation. You get something far more dangerous. You get immunity. You get secrecy. You get a financial empire that answers to no government, no regulator, no law except its own. And for decades, that's exactly what happened. The story begins not with corruption, but with survival. 1929, the year the world collapsed. The Great Depression was swallowing economies whole. Banks were failing, currencies were crumbling, and in the heart of Rome, Pope Pius XI faced a crisis of his own. The Vatican had just signed the Lateran Treaty with Mussolini, creating Vatican City as an independent state. But independence means nothing without resources, without financial infrastructure, without a bank. So in 1933, the Institute for the Works of Religion was born, the IOR, but everyone would come to know it by another name, the Vatican Bank. And from the very beginning, it was different, special, protected. It wasn't registered in Italy. It wasn't subject to Italian banking laws. It existed in a legal void, a financial shadow zone where normal rules simply didn't apply. At first, the mission seemed noble. Manage the church's wealth, protect donations from the faithful, fund missionary work across the globe. But here's what they don't tell you in Sunday school. Here's what gets buried beneath centuries of tradition and reverence. The Vatican Bank didn't just manage money. It became a conduit. Agate way, a place where money could move without questions, without oversight, without trace. And in the chaos of post-war Europe, when borders were being redrawn and allegiances were shifting, that kind of secrecy, that kind of financial invisibility became invaluable, not just to the church, but to anyone who needed to hide money, anyone who needed to move wealth across borders without governments noticing. War criminals, dictators, arms dealers, they all found sanctuary in those accounts, because the Vatican Bank had something no other institution possessed: divine protection masquerading as legal immunity. By the 1970s, the Vatican Bank was no longer just a religious institution managing donations. It had become one of the most powerful shadow banks in the world. It held accounts for thousands of clients. Not all of them religious, not all of them legitimate. The bank's assets had grown to staggering proportions, billions of dollars flowing through accounts that existed in complete darkness. No audits, no transparency, no accountability. And at the center of this financial web sat Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, a Chicago-born priest who spoke fluent money. Marcinkus wasn't just a banker. He was a Dilma, a fixer, a man who understood that in the modern world, God's work required earthly resources, and he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty to secure them. Under his leadership, the Vatican Bank entered partnerships that would make most financial regulators sick. Shell companies in Panama, offshore accounts in the Bahamas, connections to Italy's most notorious finance. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. This is where noble intentions rot into something unrecognizable, into Roberto Calvi, the banker they call God's banker. President of Banco Ambrosia, one of Italy's largest private banks. Calvi and Marcinkus became partners in a scheme so complex, so layered with deception, that even today investigators are still unraveling its tendrils. They created a network of ghost companies, fake corporations that existed only on paper. These companies would borrow money from Banco Ambrosia, hundreds of millions of dollars. But the Vatican Bank would guarantee these loans. It would vouch for these phantom entities. And then the money would simply vanish, disappear into offshore accounts, fund secret operations, pay off politicians, finance arms deals. Some say the money went to support anti-communist movements in Latin America. Others claim it funded right-wing coups, but here's what we know for certain. The money was real, the loans were real, and when the scheme finally collapsed, the debt was catastrophic. 1982, June 18th. Roberto Calvi's body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. His pockets were stuffed with bricks and cash. The official ruling, suicide, but investigators would later call it murder. A mafia execution. A message sent. Because Calvi knew too much. He had kept records. He had evidence. He had proof that the Vatican Bank wasn't just complicit in fraud. It was the architect. And when Banco Ambrosiano collapsed weeks later, it left a hole of $1.3 billion. The largest banking scandal in Italian history. And the Vatican Bank, the institution that had guaranteed those ghost loans, initially denied any responsibility, no accountability, no transparency, just ... silence. But you can't kill a story this big. You can't bury a scandal this deep. Italian prosecutors began investigating. Journalists started asking questions. And slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge. The Vatican Bank had been used as a laundromat, a place where dirty money became clean, where criminal proceeds became legitimate investments, and Archbishop Marcinkus, the man at the center of it all, retreated behind Vatican walls. Immune from arrest, protected by diplomatic status, Italy issued a warrant for his arrest, but the Vatican refused to hand him over. Because that's the thing about sovereign immunity. That's the terrifying reality of an institution that exists outside normal legal frameworks. It can shelter criminals, it can protect the guilty, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing, the outside world can do about it. If this is making your blood boil, if you're starting to see how power protects power, then you need to see what comes next. Because this story doesn't end in 19... It metastasizes, it evolves. It becomes something even more insidious. Hit subscribe now, because what we're about to reveal will change how you see every institution that claims to operate above reproach. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal should have destroyed the Vatican Bank, should have forced transparency, should have ended the era of financial secrecy cloaked in religious authority, but it didn't. Instead, the Vatican paid a settlement, $250 million to creditors, not an admission of guilt, just ... a gesture of goodwill, and then ... silence. The vaults closed again. The accounts remained secret, and the world moved on, because that's what we do, isn't it? We get outraged, we demand justice, and then we forget we let institutions too powerful to challenge simply outlast our attention spans. But the Vatican Bank didn't reform, it didn't change, it just got better at hiding. Fast forward to 2005. The United States Treasury Department adds Vatican City to its list of money laundering concerns. Why? Because the bank still operates with virtually no oversight. Because it still refuses to comply with international financial transparency standards. Because money still flows in and out of those accounts with no questions asked. The European Union begins pressuring the Vatican to adopt anti-money laundering regulations. But progress is glacial. Reforms are cosmetic. Because here's what you need to understand. Here's the fundamental truth that makes this story so disturbing. The Vatican Bank doesn't operate like a normal financial institution because it doesn't have to. It exists in a legal twilight zone. It's a sovereign entity within a sovereign state that's barely larger than a city block. It has diplomatic immunity. It has religious authority. It has centuries of accumulated wealth and power. And it has no shareholders to answer to, no board of directors, no democratic oversight, just ... the Pope, and whoever he chooses to trust. 2010, another scandal erupts. 23 million euros seized by Italian authorities investigating money laundering through Vatican Bank accounts. The president of the bank resigns. Investigations reveal accounts being used by Italian politicians to evade taxes, by businessmen to hide assets, by criminals to move money, the same patterns, the same techniques, the same institutional secrecy that had enabled the Banco Ambrosiano disaster 3 decades earlier. Nothing had changed. The reforms had been theatrical, the promises had been empty, because institutions this powerful don't change unless forced, and nobody can force the Vatican. But then something unexpected happened, 2013. Pope Benedict XVI resigned. the first pope to step down in nearly 600 years. And when Jorge Mario Bergoglio becomes Pope Francis, he inherits a financial system rotting from within, a bank that had become synonymous with corruption. And Francis, he seemed different. He came from Argentina. He understood what unchecked power does to institutions. He understood that silence is complicity. So he did something radical. He brought in outsiders, appointed a commission to investigate, ordered audits, demanded transparency. And what they found, what they uncovered in those vaults, confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. Thousands of accounts with no clear ownership, deposits from shell companies, transactions that violated international sanctions, money flowing to and from countries under embargo. The Vatican Bank had become a haven for everyone trying to hide wealth. Not just corrupt clergy, not just Italian politicians, but dictators, oligarchs, crime syndicates, anyone willing to pay the price of entry. And that price, that terrible price, was the church's reputation, its moral authority, its claim to stand for justice and righteousness. All of it, all of it, sacrificed on the altar of financial secrecy. Pope Francis closed thousands of accounts, fired executives, forced compliance with international standards. And in 2014, for the first time in its history, the Vatican Bank published a financial report. Transparency, finally, or so it seemed. Because here's the question you should be asking. Here's the question that keeps investigators up at night. If the Vatican Bank is finally clean, if the reforms are real, then why does it still exist? What purpose does a sovereign bank with no public shareholders serve in the modern world? Why does a Catholic Church, an institution that preaches humility and service, need its own private financial system? The answer they don't want you to consider is that some secrets are too valuable to abandon. Some power is too intoxicating to surrender. Today, the Vatican Bank claims to hold around 6 billion euros in assets. That's the official number, but nobody really knows, because even with reforms, even with audits, the fundamental structure hasn't changed. It's still a sovereign institution, still protected by diplomatic immunity, still capable of refusing cooperation with foreign investigators, and that means the potential for abuse still exists. The infrastructure for secrecy is still intact. The mechanisms that enabled decades of corruption are still operational. They're just quieter now, more careful, more aware that the world is watching. But here's what haunts me about this story. Here's what should disturb anyone who believes in accountability. The Vatican Bank scandal isn't just about one corrupt institution. It's a blueprint. It's proof that when you grant any organization enough sovereignty, enough secrecy, enough immunity from oversight, corruption is inevitable. Because humans are fallible, because power corrupts, because without transparency, without accountability, without consequences, even institutions founded on the highest ideals will eventually decay. And when that institution claims divine authority, when it wraps itself in the language of faith and morality, the decay becomes even more dangerous. Because who dares to question God's bank? Who has the authority to audit heaven's accounts? Think about what this means for every institution we're told to trust without question. Every organization that operates behind closed doors and tells us to have faith. Every system that claims it doesn't need oversight because its intentions are pure. The Vatican Bank proves that intentions mean nothing. That legacy means nothing. That even centuries of tradition and billions of faithful followers cannot prevent an institution from betraying its mission when secrecy is allowed to flourish. And this is the pattern repeating everywhere. In governments that classify everything as national security. In corporations that hide behind trade secrets. In financial systems so complex that nobody can follow the money. We've built a world of Vatican banks, institutions operating in shadows, claiming authority, demanding trust, offering no transparency, and we just accept it. So what do you do with this knowledge? What do you do when you realize that one of the world's oldest moral authorities spent decades enabling crime, hiding wealth, protecting the guilty? Do you lose faith in everything? Do you become cynical? Or do you demand better? Do you refuse to accept that any institution, no matter how powerful, no matter how ancient, deserves to operate without accountability, because that's the choice we face, not just with the Vatican Bank, but with every structure of power in modern society. We can accept secrecy as inevitable, or we can demand transparency as non-negotiable. We can let institutions police themselves, or we can insist on independent oversight. We can trust in good intentions, or we can require verifiable results. The Vatican Bank still operates today. Its vaults are still locked, its accounts are still private, and somewhere in those marble halls, money is still moving. Less than before, perhaps. More carefully monitored, supposedly. But moving nonetheless. And the question that matters more than any other is whether we've learned anything, whether the scandal changed anything fundamental, or whether we're just waiting for the next crisis, the next revelation, the next body hanging beneath a bridge. Because institutions don't change unless forced. And we ... we have short memories. We get outraged. We demand answers. And then ... we move on. We let the powerful outlast our attention. We let secrecy regenerate behind closed doors. We let the cycle repeat. And maybe that's the real scandal. Not what the Vatican Bank did, but what we allowed, what we tolerated, what we continue to accept every single day when we let institutions operate in darkness and tell us to have faith. Because faith without accountability is just permission for corruption. Trust without transparency is just naivety. And power without oversight is just tyranny wearing a different mask. If this revelation has shaken something loose in your mind, if you're starting to see the pattern in every institution that claims to be above question, then you need to watch what we reveal next. Because the Vatican Bank is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. A global system of secrecy and power that connects governments, corporations, and criminal enterprises in ways most people never imagine. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and prepare yourself for how deep this really goes. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you'll never trust the official story again.